for me, I think that we often think of climate change as something that we're trying to prevent in the future, but the fact that we're already at 1.1 degrees warming, that it's here, it's not a thing of the future, it's something that we need to address now to make it not get any worse. So we talk about limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And we talk about carbon emissions, but what do we mean by that? What are some of the things in that area?
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Purposeful Beauty, What's Your Purpose? Today, we're uncovering the basics of carbon with two of our internal carbon experts, Julia Creasey and Grant Mitchell. Julia, our Group Sustainability Director, has worked with Croda for 8 years, first as an application scientist before joining the sustainability team in 2017. Following the development and launch of Croda's commitment, Julia's role has been focused on embedding sustainability across the organization, developing tools and methodologies to help inform decision-making and drive behavior change. Grant has been with Croda for 19 years, mostly within personal care. He's worked in general marketing, export sales, as a research and technology manager for PVCS, and also for formulation. His focus in his current role of marketing project manager is around ingredient transparency, how Croda can make the information on our ingredients more accessible to our customers. He also looks at carbon from the beauty care point of view, how we can reduce both Croda's and our customers' carbon emissions. In this episode, Julia and Grant will cover a range of the basic carbon-related topics, like what are Scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon emissions, and how are carbon emissions impacting our climate. Also, what's a carbon footprint and why are they important? And they also discuss what steps can be made to lower our carbon impact in beauty and personal care. So listen in, and we can't wait to hear what you think about the episode. Follow us on Spotify and SoundCloud for more.
Welcome back to the latest episode of the Purposeful Beauty podcast. My name is Grant Mitchell. I'm the Marketing Project Manager in Beauty Care with a focus on carbon. I have with me today Julia Creasey, and would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everybody, so I'm Julia Creasey, Group Sustainability Director for Croda. Spent a lot of time thinking about carbon and decarbonisation and looking forward to the conversation today.
The perfect person to have on today. So our topic today is, what is the beauty industry's role in reducing carbon emissions? And so there is a lot of talk obviously around today about carbon emissions and how they're contributing to climate change. So I thought I'd start by just talking a little bit about our changes in climate. Now, we're both based in the UK. We've experienced the most recent summer that we've had here and seen the impact of climate change, with temperatures going to like 40 degrees C and sort of unprecedented levels. But as we know, there's these extreme events happening all around the world, whether it's other heat waves, wildfires, the recent flooding in Pakistan. So we know climate change is real. We know that it's caused by humans, and the warming of the planet is causing these severe weather patterns. I heard recently that these extreme weather events are 5 times higher than they were 40 years ago, which basically that's happened in my lifetime, which is a little bit scary. And it's affecting everyone globally, their livelihoods, their homes, their ability to grow food. And this is only going to increase. I think, for me, I think that we often think of climate change as something that we're trying to prevent in the future, but the fact that we're already at 1.1 degrees warming, that it's here, it's not a thing of the future, it's something that we need to address now to make it not get any worse. So we talk about limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, and we talk about carbon emissions, but what do we mean by that? What are some of the things in that area?
Yeah, absolutely. So we need, as you quite rightly mentioned, to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, and what the science tells us is that we can calculate kind of our carbon budget that we have left, the amount of carbon emissions that we can continue to emit into the atmosphere and maintain a temperature below 1.5 degrees. And so you can bring that down to a kind of company level and understand as a company or as an individual, your carbon impact, your carbon footprint, and what you can do to reduce it. So we talk about the different types of carbon emissions. There are 3 scopes of emissions. You'll probably hear those terms quite a lot. So there's scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions are those emissions that are generated when you're burning fuels yourself directly, on a manufacturing site for a company in the chemical industry, or in your house, in your natural gas in your boiler. So they're scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are the emissions that are generated when the electricity that you consume is produced. So at the point of electricity generation, those emissions at the power station are your scope 2 emissions when you then consume that electricity. And scope 3 emissions is everything else. So everything within our supply chain has carbon emissions associated with it. So this table that we're sat at would have been manufactured. There would have been emissions associated at that time. But within our industry, some of the largest categories of scope 3 emissions come from our raw materials that we're using. So all of the emissions associated with sourcing, processing those raw materials before they reach our manufacturing sites. So actually, we have quite a lot to do. What we've done at Croda and what companies around the world are doing are setting what are called science-based targets, and you've probably heard that term. And that basically is an emissions reduction target aligned with that science that tells us what we need to do to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So we have those targets in place. We need to decarbonise our operational scope 1 and 2 emissions, but actually the biggest job is in engaging with our supply chain and tackling scope 3 emissions, because that's actually where the majority of our emissions lie.
So we hear about sort of carbon footprints and we hear about life cycle analysis. Can you just give a bit of a definition and explanation of the differences between those 2 terms?
Yeah, so having carbon footprints at a product level is really useful for that kind of understanding of the carbon attached to manufacturing a product, but also to help pass on that data through the supply chain so that our customers can understand the impacts of our products as their raw materials. So a carbon footprint of a product would contain, and usually we'd call this a cradle to gate carbon footprint. So if we were generating a carbon footprint of one of Croda's ingredients, we'd consider the carbon emissions attached to all of the raw materials that go into that product. So through the sourcing and processing of those raw materials before they reached our site, and then including transportation to the site, and then all of the emissions associated with our operations. So everything we do with that raw material through to it being packaged and leaving our manufacturing site. So the energy requirements to transform those raw materials into an end product. And that would be what we would call a cradle to gate carbon footprint. If you extend that, you can look at a cradle to grave carbon footprint and then consider the impact of the use of the product and the end of life as well. So you might hear that terminology being used. But actually, when we talk about life cycle assessment, we should be considering a much more holistic environmental impact. So carbon footprint and global warming potential would be one part of a life cycle assessment, but you would then also start to think about things like water use and any other environmental impacts, eutrophication. There's all sorts of different impact factors that you can measure as part of a life cycle assessment beyond carbon footprints. I think, Grant, that I mentioned obviously that scope 3 and understanding the carbon footprint of our products that we send to our customers for their kind of scope 3, that's really important, that kind of transparency through the supply chain. So what kind of conversations are we having with our customers, and what does this mean for the personal care industry?
So I think you used the word transparency, which is really key. I think transparency and collaboration in what we're doing, that the personal care industry, like any industry, we can't just do this by ourselves. It's going to take our raw material suppliers and our customers, and then for personal care also the consumer to make changes to reduce the emissions. And I think, as you say, that we keep passing the emissions down the supply chain. So if you take a shampoo, taking a personal care example, and again saying cradle to gate, say using the gate of our end manufacturer, the producing the shampoo, that actually for an end manufacturer, 95% of their emissions are in their scope 3, so are in their supply chain. So for them to make like sort of changes and to meet their targets and their reduction targets, then they're hugely reliant on us and then everyone sort of above us upstream to make those changes. So again, it's being transparent with the data, passing that data on and collaborating on ways that we can do that, that we can ultimately meet our own targets and then hopefully meet the 1.5 degree target. I think one of the challenges that we see is the sort of not having a standard methodology, and I think things have become more and more aware of, is that calculation of carbon footprint, of how you're doing that, the boundaries, the categories that you're including, so that there needs to be a context around that it can't just be sort of just a number that, and there needs to be an idea of like what the reduction targets, what impact they're going to have on the carbon footprint as well. So I think, yeah, transparency of good quality data and collaboration on working on the solutions to reduce our emissions across the full supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the ways that the chemicals industry in general is looking to decarbonise?
So if we take our operations, our science-based target as Croda is to reduce our Scope 1 and 2, our operational emissions, by 46.2% by the end of the decade, based on 2018 baseline. And so there's a lot of work to do for us as an organisation to decarbonise our operations, and that's being seen across the industry as more companies within our sector set their own science-based targets. And we are recognised as a hard to abate industry. We do rely on quite energy-intensive processes currently. So one of our focuses has been really on how can we minimise our energy usage in the first place. So that's through things like energy efficiency, but also novel ways of manufacturing our ingredients that need less energy. And then, once we've done that and looking at ways of reducing our energy requirement, we're then looking to alternative energy sources. So sourcing renewable electricity across our global operations, but also looking for alternative sources of heat. So that could be something like a bioethanol boiler instead of natural gas, and looking for alternative fuels. So at our operations, those are some of the things that we're focusing on, and we have roadmaps in place at each of our sites as to how they're going to decarbonise. Of course, it's not just manufacturing sites, we have a lot of office locations as well. So things like switching all of our company car fleet and looking to move to electric or hybrid vehicles are other actions that we can take. And then, of course, it's across thinking about our Scope 3, it's really about that engagement with our suppliers to encourage them to set their own science-based targets and their own emissions reductions targets. We can think about our logistics and transportation distribution, how we can make that as efficient as possible. And think about as well, large capital expenditure projects is another area where we're sourcing materials. Can we make sure that we're sourcing the lowest carbon options possible when we're building new plants or putting in new processes? So there's lots of different things that we're doing. I guess it'd be interesting to hear from you, Grant, how we're supporting our customers on their decarbonisation and emissions reduction targets.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we said, that we're all responsible, we're all accountable throughout the supply chain, from the raw material supplier to Croda to the end manufacturer to the consumer. So there are things that we can all do because we're all consumers ultimately. And I think there's an education piece for consumers on their energy consumption in general. But if we go back to, say, the example of the shampoo again and look at the environmental footprint of that, there's a large proportion of that footprint that's actually in the heating of the water in the shower. So that understanding and awareness for consumers about sort of the length of time that they're spending in the shower, it's obviously going to reduce costs and bills, which is significant at the moment, but also will have that impact on the carbon emissions. I think other changes that we can all make are moving to bio-based raw materials. So the carbon emission profile of bio-based is much lower often than the petrochem alternatives, because there's no additional carbon entering into the cycle. Making changes, so like moving to sustainable palm. So when we look at sustainable palm against non-sustainable palm, there are big reductions in the carbon emissions between those. And we know that even though our amount that we've used of palm has increased, our carbon emissions related to that have actually decreased because we've had a higher proportion of sustainable palm. I think moving on to sort of like biotech solutions, there's a lot less energy involved in the synthesis there. Plant cell culture technology, where you're actually removing basically any of the growth and cultivation of the crops involved in that. So the land use is almost nothing. So again, much lower emissions resulting from that. And I think across the board, reducing water. So say it takes water to create energy, but it takes a lot of energy to supply water. So can we come up with new solutions as an industry for different product formats where we can reduce the amount of water actually in the product, and then thinking about obviously the amount of water that we're using in the use of the product. With that comes along reducing of packaging, reducing of the plastic and waste related to that. Also looking in terms of the energy that we use to sort of actually produce the end product, so moving to cold process formulations. Can we move to more liquid raw materials or look at technical solutions to incorporate solid raw materials? And I think just an awareness across the board of that carbon reductions in one area might be positive, but actually you could have had a negative impact in another area. So just again, looking across the full spectrum of it to say that you could be making a saving here, but actually making it worse in another area. So that's just a few of the possible changes we could make.
Sounds really interesting. So actually what we can do is support our customers in reducing their upstream scope 3 emissions through our manufacturing and raw material sourcing processes, but then also their downstream scope 3 emissions by helping to reduce the carbon emissions associated with the use of their products through incorporating Croda ingredients to make them more efficient or to help consumers use less energy. So that's really exciting.
And when we talk about the scopes and we talk about sort of carbon, we hear a lot of other terms like sort of net zero and carbon neutral. And again, what are some of the sort of the differences between those terms, and where do we sort of sit as a business in terms of that?
Yeah, so to be a carbon neutral business effectively means that whilst you have a plan to reduce emissions, you're offsetting your emissions that you currently have to claim carbon neutrality. It's not an option that we've gone down as an organisation. We're focusing on those emissions reductions, and whilst we're not, we may as an addition purchase some offsets where they can be where they can add real value. We don't kind of claim any offsets against our own emissions profile. We don't use them they don't count towards our science-based target. Net zero is really, really exciting, and science-based targets last year launched their kind of guidance on how to set a net zero target, and they can, only a handful of companies so far have had their net zero targets approved by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Obviously that number's increasing all the time, and that looks beyond our 2030 science-based targets and says, what's next? And across the industry, that's looking like a kind of 90% reduction in your operational and supply chain emissions by 2050, with those residual emissions being permanently removed through either kind of carbon capture and storage or forestation projects and things like that. So it's going to be a radical transformation in the way that we work as an industry, really, in it's really quite a short time frame. So we need to start thinking about what that means for us as a business, and again, how we can support our customers on that journey. Again, it's going to be looking at really radical ways of different ways of making our technologies and our ingredients through much less energy intensive processes, and then looking to things like hydrogen technology at our manufacturing sites. So yeah, really exciting to think about how we're going to get to net zero. But those emissions reductions and avoided emissions that you talked about downstream are going to be really critical in allowing everyone to kind of achieve net zero, and just in general, reduce their reliance on energy through the use of consumer care ingredients.
Okay. And I think you touched on it earlier when sort of talking about the life cycle assessments. Obviously, like we as a business and as an industry have a big focus on carbon, and when we think about climate change and reduction of carbon emissions and everything, the whole world has a focus on carbon. But what else should we be focusing on as well?
Yeah, I mean, obviously sustainability is much bigger than just carbon, and at Croda, our commitment is to be climate, land and people positive. One of the big kind of focus areas that's coming up is around nature as well, and so we're thinking about what our impacts and dependencies are on nature currently, land use, carbon, water. That's all going to form a big part of that, in biodiversity and to how we understand what it means to be net nature positive. So there's lots of other environmental impacts that we need to be thinking about, and like you mentioned earlier, there's always kind of trade-offs between some of these different factors, and life cycle assessment helps to really inform those decisions and to make sure we can do the best thing to minimise our environmental impact and also maximise our positive social impact, because that's another area that's really important to us and to the whole industry. That's probably another podcast conversation.
It probably will be indeed. So there's a lot of changes that we can make as a personal care industry or as the wider chemicals industry, and that's going to take some investment. It's going to take time and money to do that, but ultimately that's going to save us costs down the line, as we see some huge figures quoted of like sort of the cost of climate change if we don't meet the 1.5 degree target. So we have some solutions, we have some ideas. We all need to sort of collaborate and actually put those solutions into practice.
Yeah, you can read about the kind of climate related risks and the financial impacts of not transitioning towards a net zero economy, a net zero society. But also it's worth remembering that there are a lot of opportunities here for innovation across the industry as well, in lots of exciting ways to move towards lower carbon products and applications, and really support that transition, which will just mean that we can protect this world that we live in and want to keep enjoying.
Thank you, Julia. It's been a really interesting discussion. I love talking about all things carbon and climate, and I'll definitely take you up on the offer of a follow-up podcast episode. So thank you for your time today, and we hope to hear from you again soon.
Great. Thanks, Grant. Thanks, everybody.